Welcome to another episode of Workforce Wednesday. I am here with my good friend Brett Landrum with ProCare HR. And if you take a look at the title, you see that we are going to have a conversation with Joe Signori. Did I pronounce that right?
Signor.
And he had a last minute thing come up and he couldn't make it. And so we are going to have a conversation about the role that data and analytics plays in the business of senior living. This is something that Brett's super passionate about. I was at the NIC Data and Analytics Conference here a few days ago, and it's clearer and clearer that data will make the difference in the coming years over companies that are super successful and super not. So Brett, let's start by just talking a little bit about who you are, what you're passionate about, and let's maybe some opening thoughts on data and how we use it to be better.
ProCare HR, we're a comprehensive HR services organization tailored to senior care. And really the vision for our organization and our operating belief is that if we can improve the people functions and I'll say some of the ancillary functions surrounding people related activities, that we can have a demonstrable and measurable impact on quality of care, resident satisfaction, and financial results. And so really everything we do at ProCare is about marching towards that vision. And we're spent the last number of years really working on the core foundational offering for HR services, things like the basics, benefits administration, HR services, et cetera. And over the last couple of years have been able to start investing in and working on some of the the things that get you and I excited. Things like how can we leverage data to inform actions of our clients? How can we actually develop some of those proof points for, hey, if we pull this HR lever, this is the impact on quality of care, resident satisfaction, and financial performance for operators. So we're really excited to talk about data and the role it plays in HR.
Cool. So I think that as I look at so when I first started writing about, Senior Living Foresight, their point-click care was out there and they were doing this thing, and mostly people used it in the nursing home space, and mostly they used it because they had to use it, and it was this repository of data. And everybody else, particularly on the senior living side, non-skilled nursing was mostly still using paper or some very rudimentary technology tools. And when I first started this, I would say probably 50 or 60% of the buildings didn't even have pervasive Wi-Fi throughout the buildings. And of course, that's changed. And now we're awash with data. But I don't know that we're very good at trying to figure out how to actually use that data. Thoughts on that? How do we get to how do we bridge that gap?
So we've had prior conversations, I would say, over the last 12 months, you and I, about kind of the role of technology. And in order to get access to data, we have to first be deploying technology in our systems and our workflows so that it's supporting operations in a meaningful fashion. That then gives us access to the data. My personal belief, I think senior care has done a really good job as an industry as of the last couple of years of looking at all the different operational systems and saying, how do we leverage technology to deploy it? I think places where they struggle are really getting persistency of use, depth and breadth of use across the organization, which that's foundational to, again, then being able to get the data, right? Like the senior executives can all deploy these systems and use them to access information. But if, the folks at the community level are struggling to understand how to leverage them or input information, or et cetera, like, hey, the data is only as good as what we put into the system and how we leverage it. So, but I think that's a problem a lot of organizations have committed to solving and have been being creative and diligent in getting, system utilization to a reasonable place. Now that it's there, and we see this in our business, the real question is, what's the information that you need to see and at what frequency? And then, how do we, what's the information that we can act on? And I'll say, I'll maybe preface this with, I'm probably the wrong guy in our organization to have this discussion. We were fortunate enough to have, brought Clarent Data, which is a senior living data company, into our family of businesses actually a few weeks ago now. And so, we'll have to have another session here with Paul Jarvis, who can speak much more intelligently to the role that the data can play in senior living than I can. But as we've started working with the two founders of that business, we've gotten some we've made some interesting headway on a thesis related to data and how it can support a better organization in senior care. And really the underlying theme is, if we think about, I'll use our business as an example. If we look at our scorecard and we see consistent issues with the leading indicators in our business, it's really hard as an executive team to say, how are we going to carve out the time to go solve this big problem? Because when we see this data, and usually it takes, we're not a really big company, but we're a mid-sized organization, still very entrepreneurial and flexible. And even for us, it still takes a lot of time to figure out, what's the root cause of the issue, how do we diagnose it and triage it, and then what's the action plan, and then you got to get to executing the action plan. And these two, the two founders of Clarent, their belief, and I'm in agreement with them, is like, yes, we want to look at our scorecard and our leading indicators and all of our key KPIs on some level of frequency. But their belief is where data become really powerful is when it's daily in such a way that informs action. Like it tells you, hey, what's the information in what area do I and my leaders and different team members need to take the small daily incremental action that when you add up, 1%, 1% over a month, over a 30, 60, 90-day period, you see, demonstrable changes in the key KPIs you're looking at. Versus if you just look at the key KPIs every day, oftentimes it doesn't go deep enough and it's not at like the actionable level right out of the gates. And so, I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I will think of one.
So let me try two different examples with you and see if you can help me with because they're areas that I've thought about. So one of the huge opportunities I see is, and I think this, we probably see it today. We're probably further along in the resident care side than we are on the employee care side, but I think maybe there are opportunities on the employee side as well. So with residents, we have all this data. We have some of it is very objective, blood pressure and lab tests and those kinds of things. And then others are more subjective, notes from a caregiver and those kinds of things. And there's a lot of excitement by the idea that you can take this, dump it into AI or some sort of an algorithmic system that can do an early identification of areas where there's decline that has opportunity to be improved, which increases the quality of life of the resident and increases length of stay. So it has economic impact and kind of everybody wins on that, right? And those are sort of almost formulaic kinds of things where you just need to figure it out, but that at some proportion of the time that's going to work. So, but the other part that becomes, I think, more difficult is I've got well, we'll use I was going to use marketing, but maybe I'll give them to you both. So the first one would be, I'll use the marketing one first, and I'll move to HR. So I get this daily or I get this weekly or monthly report, and it shows that my occupancy is declining, or that my leads, the number of leads that are coming in are declining. And so that's, first off, it's going to tell me I'm likely to have an occupancy problem, but it's a long way from actually telling me what to do about it. And on the HR side, it could be I've got an increase in applicants, but I'm not converting those to employees, or I'm losing more people. So how do you I know I've thrown you this big rat's nest to unravel.
Let me give an
talk about it.
Let me give you an example that they have given me recently to like embody this concept of using kind of daily data for daily actions to make incremental progress to a larger KPI. Perfect. So they use the example of like average rate. So a lot of organizations are looking on a weekly, monthly, whatever it is basis on what's our average rate. Well, like that, to your point, that doesn't really tell me what do I do with that. Whereas their idea is, hey, what if I had a notification that told me, whatever residents I had on that day or in that week that hadn't had a rate renewal in 12 months or 24 months. Like that's clearly actionable. And and by taking daily action on that and weekly action on that, it impacts the KPI that the executive team is going to be looking at every month, which is what's our average rate. And so to me, that's a really good example of, okay, I can look at what my average rate is, but like that executive team, if they say, hey, that's lower than target, that's lower than we would like, it feels like this big size, like, massive issue to say, okay, now we got to send somebody to triage it, figure out what the issue is, build a strategy and execution plan, and then we have to execute to it. Versus if I'm looking at something like the rate renewals on a daily, weekly basis, that's the leading indicator, an actionable, data point to this bigger KPI that we really need to keep in mind to operate the business effectively from a financial performance perspective. And so I think, like I said, that really embodies their thesis here. And like I said, it's one as the more we've integrated them into our organization and we've been able to have discussions with them, it's a compelling one in my opinion.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I think that, and so I'm going to sort of extend this conversation a little bit. So I have a friend who runs a memory care building, and he just got a single building. He's got an amazing manager. The financial performance on it is great. Resident satisfaction is high. They're full. All these things, and so a caregiver. And this starts as sort of an anecdotal kind of thing. Caregiver comes to the manager and says, I'm not getting enough help. I need more help to take care of my 8 residents or 6 residents or whatever it is. And the manager goes and says, well, okay, but the data tells us that based on the levels of care, that you actually have more, you should be able to handle another resident, and you're saying you can't do that. And so now you've got this loggerhead. And so she takes the next step and she sits down and she says, okay, let's actually walk through these residents and the levels of care. And so turns out that while all these residents in her mind and on paper as they were billing were all level 1 residents, when you actually step back and again, this is all done by hand, it wasn't in the system, maybe should be, that they were, many of them, maybe all of them, needed to be at a higher level of care, which means she was actually right that she wasn't able to do everything she needed to do, but that you also had to deal with the compensation of getting care for that. So how do you take that and take this data to solve these problems and keep it human? And can you systematize that?
100%. Like we can pick on that example a little bit, and I don't know that I'm going to get to like the right translation for how does that go to daily actionable information. But it's like the question I would ask is, what are the leading indicators, or what are the actions that are ultimately going to lead to understanding the right care mix that are like daily? Like, what are the things that need to happen? And so it might be, hey, we have to log our ADLs. We need to, log this, all, as an example, like if we're not logging all of the work that we need to do, then we're not going to know whether care is off. But I think that's the question would be, what are the actions that we need to take? And then we can figure out, how do we measure them? And so, maybe there's a care plan element, maybe there's a logging making sure folks are actually kind of logging the activity and the needs, et cetera. Maybe it's, hey, we've had a change. Like, here's an example, actually, is maybe it's a metric that's like, hey, if we have we had more than a 10% change in the care provided, like for any particular resident, it flags you. Well, okay, like that's something I know what to do with. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I know I go look at that resident, and I don't have to do a big analysis on everybody at once, because I'm looking at that every day and I'm actioning the little things every day. But then when I get to the end of the month or the quarter, I don't have a case mix issue because I've been alerted to and taking action on the little, that little thing every single day.
Yeah. And I think part of what's really hard about this is that in this particular case, one of the things that came out of the discussion is that the caregiver already knew that, and from her perspective, the care was really, really expensive. And so she didn't want to add financial burden to the family. And so she was sort of perhaps under-reporting the amount of care that she was giving to protect the financial situation of the family. Now, the postscript to this, and this becomes an educational perspective thing, is that when they actually went to the families and explained the levels of care, and that they need, in order to do a good job for mom or dad, they needed to increase the pay and they needed to increase the staffing. They didn't have a single family that balked at it. That they all said, "Oh yeah, we make that. We can see that mom needs more care, dad needs more care." And so a lot of this, how do you tie the human element in with the data stuff?
Yeah, very compelling question. I think the one, it's everybody's going to say this, but it's engagement and incentive. And incentives aren't necessarily financial. Incentives
Right.
are, like in this particular scenario, the caregiver had a big heart for the, for the resident and the resident's family, et cetera. Them understanding that, hey, my incentive to make sure I'm logging everything appropriately is like, what happens if I'm not there? Is the person that, and I haven't logged everything, and thus we have the wrong case mix. We're trying to, I as the caregiver, I'm trying to help this resident, but I actually may be doing them a disservice because that particular resident may not get the care on a day I'm not available, because the organization as a whole isn't aware that the needs have changed. And so I think there's, education, incentive, and then there's also again, it's back to that, like, what's the action? And one of the things I would say that the areas we're trying to educate and anticipate educating and specific with how we think about KPIs and some of the tools we're looking at building, isn't that like the data is going to flex every day because it's people entering the information, period, full stop. It's never going to be perfect. So what we're looking at is, when we talk about what are the things we can action, we're looking for changes. What we're thinking about building alerts and notifications for is, what are changes in the information that then instigate again, these small little actions. And so again, in the example of the case mix, it's like, if any particular resident has a 10% increase in the amount of care provided, that's a flag, and that goes to the nurse and the ED, and then the nurse goes and looks at it and says, "Oh, this has happened 4 days in a row. Maybe we need to investigate and update the care plan." And that's like an easy thing. I shouldn't say easy, but that's a digestible action that we can take. And if we take that, like, again, broken record here, but if we take that type of action every day, week, quarter, month, or et cetera, we're going to get, we're going to solve our case mix issue, or certainly make meaningful progress on it, versus we look at it on an interim basis and then say, okay, we think we have this broad case mix issue. How do we action that? Where does that fall in the broader priorities of the organization? It becomes this monumental task to address our case mix issue, versus if we were looking at actionable data every single day that somebody at the community level could utilize and convert to a task, and one simple task, then those add up over time.
Yeah, and what I really like about that, Brett, is that we tend to, I think I tend to worry, maybe people in general tend to worry that when you get so data driven, you take the human equation out of it. But I would argue that, again, going back to my story, what was really happening was the caregiver was, in fact, the residents were being cheated because she couldn't actually do all the work that needed to be done. And so it got done in a poor way, which then hurts the quality of life for the resident, hurts the bottom line for the community. It potentially hurts the reputation for the community, because we know that if you have inadequate staffing and things don't get done, bad things can happen. And so go ahead.
That's the perfect, what you just said, perfect example. So I look at a quality, I'm a senior living operator. I look at a quality score. My quality scores start going down.
Yep.
What do I do about that? Like, that becomes, again, this monumental task and project to dig into and build strategies around, versus if I'm looking at the small change in the small metric every single day, you're leading people to take those small little actions so that we don't have this big, huge quality control problem. And look, I don't think that those types of actionable insights, we can have 100 of them. I think you can overwhelm everybody. It's like, what are the critical outcomes that we're striving for in the business and in the industry? And I think we're going to find that they're pretty similar across most operators. And what are the key actions and things we need to be looking at on a daily, data points that we need to be looking at on a daily basis to influence those? And, and so really you're looking for, what are the tasks that our key people and team members should be doing every day? And how do we alert when those key tasks, may have a big fluctuation or a change or not be completed in a certain fashion, et cetera? Again, that then translates to the broader outcomes that we're striving for.
So I want to actually talk. I want to have a little bit of a conversation about a build or buy conversation. I'm seeing more and more operators who are hiring their own data scientists, their own people who are building their own dashboards and investing a lot of money in that. There are also companies, including the one that you recently acquired, who are sort of doing that as a business. And the people who are building their own would say that's sort of part of their secret sauce. You'd obviously say something different. And I actually have fairly strong feelings about this, but I'd like to kind of hear from you first.
I would kind of, ironically, I'm undecided on.
Okay.
So there's leveraging data to improve KPIs and outcomes, and then there's bringing all of the data from all your systems to be able to look at and measure and leverage the KPIs that you want, that are driving your business. Those are two different things. And so my kind of working thesis that I'd say we've been noodling on and working at ProCare is potentially actually building your, how you want to measure your business and how you want to look at the data and bringing all that stuff together. There's actually a lot of merits to having that be an internal project and having internal ownership over it and bringing in outside parties. I'm not saying that there's not a compelling reason to potentially outsource that. I think you get the benefit of that outsourcing organization or that partner is doing this for a large swath of operators. And so theoretically they've got some learning lessons and that you now have access to by partnering with them versus trying to do it yourself. I think it's an organizational focus question at times. And then there's the economic side of it. But I think I could go either way on, and don't have a firm position on the, I would say, what KPIs our team is looking at on a regular basis, how we measure our business, success, et cetera, and whether that's an in-house or a partnership, a vendor, et cetera. I think this idea, again, I'm biased because we're currently kind of toying with the development of this solution, right. But the idea of how do we how do we build the daily actionable insights across lots of different stakeholders that ultimately influence those outcomes? Personally, I think that's better to be like, I think that's better as a partner or vendor. And the reason is, I think there's going to be so much work around what's the right number and at what level and what are the actions that we take and how do we incentivize and educate around the actions. ProCare, at our core, we're a tech-enabled service. So we're not a technology development company. We're starting to do, and I would say build a muscle around technology development. But the reason I believe our business model is successful is because there's a services element. How do we best drive utilization? How do we educate? How do we train? How do we, execute on some of those key initiatives? And we're leveraging technology to do that. So again, biased admittedly, but I think the idea that we're talking about around this daily actionable insights, driven down and across the organization to different stakeholders that ultimately influence outcomes, I think that's better as a vendor partner. Internal KPIs, how we measure, how we, like I said, not entirely convinced one way or the other.
Yeah, I think on the internal KPIs, those are all could almost be secret sauce kinds of things. But I spent 10 years working in Silicon Valley selling software that was used to design computer chips. And the problems are massive. You can spend $1 million. Back when I was selling it, you could spend $1 million per seat per year for some of these tools because the problems were so massive. And initially, IBM and AMD and Intel, they all built their own tools as well as building silicon because they felt like that was part of their IP. But what they discovered was, as the problems became bigger, that the cost of maintaining those tools and updating those tools became so big, and they were all looking at it from a single perspective, and they weren't being able to take in different perspectives, and the tools just weren't good enough anymore. And so pretty much everybody now buys, you wouldn't really call them off the shelf tools because they still get a lot of IP that's done that is very specific to the secret sauce of the technology companies. So you look at NVIDIA, which is just crushing it with chips used in AI. I guarantee you they're using, if you will, off the shelf tools, but then they're still going in and heavily modifying it. So I would maybe apply that to your internal KPIs that you have to figure out. And I worry a lot that people are going to build all these tools and they're just going to be putting resources on them. They're not really going to know. They're going to have all this interesting data, but not really know what to do with it.
100%. And that's where that is the value of the partnership with a vendor, is they can help guide you through, this is how to look at it, this is how to interpret it, this is how to execute to it, versus just here's what it is. Because look, any great operator, executive, et cetera, can do all those same things. It's just, do they have the time and the capacity to work on that versus the other elements of their business? And that's ultimately the decision on, outsourcing versus in-house, or build versus buy, or, build versus partner, is, do I want to focus the organizational energy on figuring this thing out, or partner with somebody who has figured it out and has a lot of use case across, a large population of operators? And each organization's got to make their own decision on where they see the value.
Yeah, I'm certainly would be willing to say that they're going to be, it's not a one size fits all. So there may be places where it makes it more sense to do it in-house, and other places. But I do know that as an industry, there seems to be a lot of resistance to outsourcing, not just data, HR and food service, and so many things. And yet in other industries, we see huge amounts of outsourcing so they can really focus on what their core business is. I think over the last, we've hundreds of conversations every year with operators, and
over the last 2 years coming out of COVID, we've seen a pretty material shift in the perspective of the market. And what we're seeing, I think what COVID highlighted is the need and desire to have a broader bench, more experts, more horsepower available when we need it. The ability to scale up and scale down rapidly, be a little bit more nimble, which I think outsourcing tends to support. And also really reinvigorating that focus on what's our core business. It's taking care of people, and how do we bring in best-in-class partners around that to support the other facets of our organization that need to be done well and executed cleanly. But we're going to focus on this thing, which is our core competency, and we're going to allow others to vie for partnership opportunity with us in these areas that aren't our core competency.
Cool. Well, listen, we're about out of time. Did I miss anything that I want to say? Should be saying? I mean, there's so much more to talk about for 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
So, but I guess I'm gonna give a little plug for you, because I'm probably more likely to do it than you are for yourself. If you're struggling with your HR stuff, if you are thinking it could be better in terms of how you take care of the processes, and what it costs you to implement, you should reach out to Brett, talk to him. They can make a huge difference in the satisfaction, team satisfaction, and likely save you some money too. So I appreciate your friendship, your support, and I'll get to see you in person again in a couple of weeks in Palm Springs.
Sounds good. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Thank you.